The night Elliot Drummond turned down $1.4 billion, he was wearing a tie he'd borrowed from his neighbor. That detail shouldn't matter. But it does, somehow. Because the tie was a little too short, and he'd been self-conscious about it all evening, tugging at the knot in the elevator, wondering if the Ashworth-Kincaid family would notice. They noticed everything. That was the whole point of people like them. Elliot had driven himself to the Pearson Grand in a 7-year-old Mazda with a cracked dashboard and a coffee thermos wedged between the seats. He'd left his daughter Zoe with Mrs. Okafor next door, who smelled of lavender and always had ginger cookies on the counter. Zoe was 9. She'd been doing homework at the kitchen table when he left, her tongue tucked in the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she concentrated, and she'd looked up and said, without any particular feeling, "You look nice, Dad." He'd held on to that for the whole drive downtown. Elliot had started Northline Clean Tech out of a garage in Guelph 7 years before that dinner. Not a metaphorical garage, not a Silicon Valley punchline. An actual detached garage with a space heater that clicked and groaned and barely worked, where he'd spent 2 winters in a park of reverse engineering thermal recapture systems while Zoe slept inside the house under 4 blankets. His wife, Diane, had died when Zoe was 18 months old. A brain aneurysm, fast and without warning, the kind that doesn't give you a chance to say anything important. One morning she was there, and by that afternoon she wasn't, and the world kept moving in that indifferent way it has, and Elliot had to figure out how to be a father to an infant while also figuring out how to keep breathing. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Waterloo. He had no money. He had a daughter who needed him to be more than the hollow shape grief had made him into. So he worked. He took contracts wherever he could find them. Consulting, repairs, energy audits for commercial buildings from Windsor to Ottawa. He drove a lot of kilometers in those years. He listened to a lot of audiobooks and talked to Zoe in the back seat in a way that was probably more honest than a 9-month-old needed. He told her about Diane. He told her about the problem he was trying to solve. He talked to her like she understood, because it helped him think, and because she was the only person around. Northline started as a side project. A solution he'd been working through in his head to a problem that had been bugging him for years: the extraordinary amount of thermal energy lost in commercial refrigeration cycles, particularly in grocery chains and food distribution warehouses. The math was there. The technology existed in fragments. Nobody had assembled it correctly. He assembled it correctly. By the time Zoe started school, Northline had its first pilot contract with a regional grocery distribution center outside of Hamilton. By the time she was in grade 3, they had 11 clients across Ontario and 2 in Alberta. By the time she was in grade 4 and doing homework with her tongue tucked in the corner of her mouth, Elliot had built something that a lot of people with a great deal of money had started paying very close attention to. One of those people was Reginald Ashworth. The Ashworth-Kincaid Group was the kind of company that didn't need to advertise itself. It existed in the background of things, a shareholder here, a board seat there. A quiet word in the right ear during the right conversation. They had holdings in energy, infrastructure, real estate, and 3 other sectors that Elliot had needed to look up when their initial letter arrived. The family had been wealthy for long enough that their wealth had stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a geological feature, just something that was there. Reginald Ashworth was 71. His son Fletcher Ashworth-Kincaid was 44 and ran the day-to-day operations of the group's energy division with the kind of cheerless efficiency that came from knowing you hadn't really earned your position. Fletcher's wife, Dorothea, sat on 3 charitable boards and had opinions about everything. Elliot had done his research. He always did his research. The initial approach had been through an intermediary, a business development consultant named Priscilla Ng, who'd reached out in September with careful language and a meeting request. Elliot had his own lawyer, a sharp woman named Janet Ferris out of Kitchener, who had talked him through enough bad contracts that he trusted her instincts absolutely. Janet had reviewed the preliminary terms and raised an eyebrow and said, "This is serious. Don't say yes to anything until we've talked." He hadn't said yes to anything. He'd said he was interested in a conversation. The conversation had led to 3 months of due diligence, 3 rounds of term sheet revisions, and the dinner at the Pearson Grand, which was apparently how the Ashworth-Kincaid family liked to close things. A dinner, an atmosphere. A table with more cutlery than Elliot had ever seen arranged beside a single plate. The offer on the table was a majority acquisition of Northline, $1.4 billion, structured across 2 tranches with Elliot staying on as technical director for a minimum of 4 years. It was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of number that should end a conversation before it starts. Elliot had nodded when Priscilla had outlined it. He had thought about Zoe in the garage, about the space heater, about the kilometers. He had thought, let me meet these people first. The Ashworths arrived at the private dining room 12 minutes late without acknowledgement. Reginald came first with the slow, deliberate walk of a man who had decided somewhere in his 60s that he would never hurry again. Fletcher followed, and behind him Dorothea, and behind her a younger woman who was introduced as Fletcher's sister, Margot, and who had the kind of beauty that had probably made her life both easier and harder than she deserved. Elliot stood when they entered. He wasn't sure why. Force of habit, maybe. His mother had raised him to stand when people came into a room. Reginald shook his hand without looking at him. That was the first thing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rude in any way that could be easily named. Reginald simply extended his hand while his eyes traveled around the room, reading the art on the walls, and Elliot's hand was just an object that needed to be grasped and released as part of the process of entering. Like checking a coat. Dorothea smiled at him with enormous warmth and said, "You must be the engineer," in a tone that made the word feel like a category, like a species, like something filed away in a drawer. "Elliot Drummond," he said. "Nice to meet you." She tilted her head at him and said, "Of course," and moved toward her seat. They sat. Wine was poured. Reginald began talking about a trip to Portugal, and Fletcher responded, and Margot asked a question about someone named Cecile, and Elliot sat at the corner of the table where he'd been placed and listened, and tried to figure out whether he was expected to participate in this conversation, or simply wait for the one he'd come to have. 10 minutes passed. 15. The appetizers arrived. Elliot ate his and said nothing, because nothing was being asked of him, and because he'd learned in the years of contracts and meetings and deals that almost happened, and deals that didn't, that silence was rarely the worst option. Then Dorothea turned to him, set her fork down with a small decisive click, and said, "So, what does a man like you do with money like that?" The table went quiet in that way. Tables go quiet when something has been said that wasn't quite a question. Elliot looked at her. "I'm sorry?" $1.4 billion, she said pleasantly. "That's a significant amount of money to put into the hands of someone who's been, running a garage operation in Guelph?" "Hamilton, mostly," he said. "We're headquartered in Guelph, but our main facility is outside Hamilton." "Of course," she smiled again. "I'm only saying that it's an extraordinary leap, from your background to this." Elliot set his own fork down, carefully. "My background in mechanical engineering and 7 years building a company that now has 62 employees and clients in 4 provinces. Your background," Dorothea said, and there was a pause that was doing a lot of work, as a person without, shall we say, experience at this level. Fletcher was watching his wine glass. Margot's was looking at the middle distance. Reginald was eating, apparently uninvested in the conversation he had allowed to begin. "I've structured 9 acquisitions in the past 4 years, Elliot said. "Smaller than this, but not by as much as you might think. I have legal counsel, financial advisors, and an operations team I trust. I don't think the question is whether I have experience at this level. I think the question is whether Northline's technology justifies the number your family has put on the table. And does it?" Fletcher said, speaking for what felt like the first time. "I think you already know the answer to that," Elliot said. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be here." Something shifted in the room. "Not much. A degree or 2. Then Dorothea said, "You came alone." "I did." "No partner." "No." She made a small gesture with her hand. "Family representation?" It was a strange thing to say. Elliot understood what she was doing, had understood it from the moment they'd walked in late, from the handshake that wasn't, from the word engineer in that particular tone. But hearing it said out loud still landed somewhere unpleasant in his chest. "My wife passed away 8 years ago," he said. "I have a daughter. She's 9. She's at home." "Oh," Dorothea said. The warmth in her voice rearranged itself into something that was supposed to resemble sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must be very difficult, managing all of this. Without support." She said support the way someone might say ballast, as if the absence of a spouse was not a personal grief but a structural deficiency, a gap in the scaffolding. "We manage," Elliot said. "Of course you do." She picked up her fork again. "I only wonder, and I say this with genuine concern, whether a man in your position managing a child alone and now taking on something of this scale is perhaps spreading himself a little thin." The table was very quiet. Elliot looked at her. He looked at Fletcher, who was still examining his wine. At Reginald, who had finished eating and was now folding his napkin with the attention of a man who had removed himself entirely from the proceedings. He thought about Zoe at the kitchen table, tongue in the corner of her mouth. "You look nice, Dad." He thought about the garage, the space heater, the kilometers. He thought about Diane and what Diane would have said, and he almost smiled. Then he said quietly and without anger, "I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. You've put a $1.4 billion offer on the table for my company. You've had 3 months to review our financials, our contracts, our technology, and our team. Your own consultants have produced reports that describe Northline as, I'm quoting here, a category-defining solution in an underserved market with exceptional IP protection. And now at dinner, you're questioning whether I'm capable of handling this because I'm raising my daughter without a partner. No one said anything. I want to make sure, he continued, because I want to give you the opportunity to tell me that's not what you meant. Dorothea opened her mouth. Reginald said, without looking up from his folded napkin, Dorothea. She closed her mouth. Fletcher cleared his throat. I think what my mother is expressing. I heard what your mother expressed, Elliot said. Not loudly, not harshly, just clearly. He reached for his water glass, took a drink, set it down. I've spent 7 years building something real, he said, in a market that ignored it before I got there. I've done it while raising a child and losing a wife and every other thing that life puts in front of a person. I didn't come here tonight to defend my competence or my family situation. I came here to talk about a business arrangement. He paused. So I'd like to ask, is this the level of conversation we're going to be having? Or is there a different conversation available? The room held its breath. Then Reginald Ashworth looked up from his napkin for the first time in 20 minutes and looked at Elliot. Really looked. There was something in the old man's face that Elliot couldn't quite read. Not respect, not quite, but something in that neighborhood. Reginald said nothing. Neither did anyone else. Elliot pushed his chair back from the table. Not dramatically. Just the ordinary scrape of a chair on a floor. I'm going to give you some time to talk amongst yourselves, he said. I'll be in the lobby. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, nodded to the table, and walked out. The lobby of the Pearson Grand had the hushed quality of expensive spaces, carpet thick enough to swallow sound, lighting warm and amber, a fountain somewhere doing something tasteful with water. Elliot sat in an armchair near the window that overlooked the street and loosened the borrowed tie and watched the traffic. He wasn't shaking. He'd half expected to be shaking. He thought about Janet Ferris. She was going to ask him what happened, and he was going to have to tell her, and she was going to make a face he could already picture. He thought about what $1.4 billion would actually mean, the employees he'd be able to protect, the research he could fund, the things that would be possible instead of just theoretically possible. He thought about Dorothea's voice when she said support. He checked his phone. There was a text from Mrs. Okafor. Zoe has finished her homework and wants to know if she can stay up until you're home. She says it's important. He smiled. It was always important. He typed back, tell her yes. But she has to be in bed by 10. 3 dots appeared. Then she says 10:30. He typed 9:45. 3 dots, then deal. He was still smiling when Fletcher appeared at the edge of the lobby, moving toward him with the slightly too casual walk of a man who had lost an argument and was recalibrating. Fletcher sat in the chair across from him without asking if the chair was free. I want to apologize, he said. Elliot waited. For my mother. It wasn't the tone we intended for this evening, wasn't it? Fletcher was quiet for a moment. No, it wasn't. Okay, Elliot said. She has very set ideas about, Fletcher started and then seemed to think better of the sentence he was building. She doesn't always express them in the most constructive way. That's one way to put it. Fletcher looked at his hands. He had the hands of someone who had never done physical work, smooth and pale, and something about them made Elliot feel briefly the absence of his own calluses. We'd like to continue the conversation, Fletcher said. My father, this matters to him. The acquisition. He thinks your technology is genuinely important, and he's not wrong about things like that. He's not wrong about much, but he lets your mother set the tone. Fletcher didn't answer that. I'm not going to pretend the last hour didn't happen, Elliot said. And I need you to understand something. The conversation that just happened in there, whatever its intent, is the kind of thing I will not navigate for 4 years as part of a working relationship. I'm not interested in proving myself to anyone. My work has done that already, I understand. Do you? Fletcher looked at him, and Elliot saw something in his face, underneath the smooth surface of it, under the board meeting composure, something that looked, briefly, like a man who was tired of his own family. Yes, Fletcher said. I do. They sat for a moment. I need to think, Elliot said. I need to talk to my counsel, and I need to go home. Of course, Fletcher stood, extended his hand, actually looked at Elliot this time when he did it. I hope we can still make this work. Elliot shook his hand, didn't commit to anything. He drove home in the Mazda with the cracked dashboard and the coffee thermos and the radio playing something low and indistinct, and he thought the whole way home without reaching any conclusions, which was unusual for him. He sat with Janet for 3 hours the next morning. She let him talk first, which was what she always did, and he laid it out. The dinner, the comments, the lobby conversation with Fletcher, the apology that was half an apology, the offer still on the table. When he finished, Janet set down her pen and looked at him and said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do," she said. "You just want someone to tell you it's reasonable." He looked at the wall of her office. There was a photograph of a lake in Muskoka, gray-green water under an overcast sky that she'd had up for as long as he'd been her client. "If I walk away," he said, "it's not because of the money. The money it's real. It would mean real things for real people. I know. It's about whether I can sit across a table from that family for 4 years and know what was said about me. About Zoe. About our life. She called your daughter a liability," Janet said bluntly. She didn't use that word. She didn't have to. He looked at the lake photograph again. "There are other buyers," Janet said. "There will be other offers. Maybe not $1.4 billion. Maybe something different. But Northline's value doesn't disappear because the Ashworth Kincaids decide they want to play games at dinner. They might not do another deal like this." "They might not," Janet agreed, "but you also might not spend 4 years watching your back and wondering what they're saying about you in rooms you're not in. That has a value, too. You just can't put a number on it." He drove home slowly. He made Zoe's lunch for the next day. He read to her before bed. They were partway through a book about a girl who discovers a lighthouse on a cliff, and the lighthouse turns out to be something other than what it seems. And Zoe fell asleep during a chapter, and he sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes in the dark, listening to her breathe. He thought, "This is what I built everything around. Not the number. This." He thought about what Diane would have said. He knew exactly what she would have said. She would have looked at him with that particular directness she'd had, the kind that saw through the noise of a situation down to the center of it, and she would have said, "You already know, Elle. You've known since dinner." He had. He'd known in the lobby, if he was honest about it. Maybe before the lobby. The next morning, he called Janet. "I'm declining," he said. A pause. "Okay, is that Elliot? It's your company. It was always your call. I know, but I wanted to say it out loud to someone first." "You just did," she said. "I'll draft the letter." He sent a brief, professional response through Janet. No explanation beyond the business language of it, after careful consideration, pursuing a different direction for Northline at this time, which was the kind of language that communicated without oversharing. 3 days later, Reginald Ashworth called him directly. Not through Priscilla, not through Fletcher. Directly. Elliot almost didn't answer. He answered. Reginald's voice on the phone was different than it had been at dinner. Less stage-managed, quieter. He said, "Mr. Drummond, I wanted to call personally. I appreciate that. My wife." A pause. "The things said at dinner were not sanctioned by me. I want you to know that." "I believe you," Elliot said. He did believe him, mostly. It didn't change anything. "I think you're making a mistake," Reginald said. "Not because of the money. Because your technology deserves the platform we can give it." "Maybe," Elliot said, "but platform isn't the only thing I was evaluating." A long pause. "No," Reginald said. "I suppose it wasn't." Something in the old man's voice, not regret, exactly. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of a person who has watched something that could have been handled differently get handled wrong. "Good luck with Northline," Reginald said finally. "Thank you," Elliot said. "I'll need it." "No," said Reginald, and there was something almost dry in it. "I don't think you will." He hung up. 6 weeks later, Northline signed a partnership agreement with a mid-sized clean energy fund out of Vancouver. Not an acquisition, a partnership, which was a different structure and a different kind of relationship. One without a majority transfer and without a 4-year chain. The numbers were smaller. The control remained Elliot's. Janet called it a solid deal. His operations manager, a pragmatic man named Stewart, who had been with Northline since year 2, called it the right move, and then immediately went back to talking about the Q2 installation schedule, which was how Stewart expressed approval. Zoe made him a card on the occasion of signing. It had a drawing of a building with a sun on it, which was apparently meant to be Northline, and inside it said, in her careful looping handwriting, "Congratulations, Dad, you did it." Again. He put it on the fridge. He kept it there. There's a thing that happens when you make a choice like that. People want it to be a story with a clean arc. You walk away from the money, the universe rewards you, the scoreboard ends in your favor. And sometimes it works that way. Sometimes it doesn't. The Ashworth Kincaid group went on, as groups like that do, absorbing other things, making other deals, moving through the world with a particular momentum of people who have never needed to justify themselves. Elliot didn't win in any spectacular cinematic sense. He didn't lose either. What he had was Northline, which was real and growing, and a partnership that gave it room to grow in a way that felt right. He had 62 employees, 67 by the following spring, who had mortgages and families and futures that were connected to the thing he'd built in a garage in Guelph in a parka while his daughter slept inside. He had Zoe, who was 9 and getting into arguments about bedtimes and doing homework with her tongue in the corner of her mouth, who sometimes asked about her mother with the calm curiosity of a child who has grown up knowing a shape without filling it in, and Elliot answered her honestly and as fully as he could, because that was the only way he knew to do it. He had a cracked dashboard and a coffee thermos and the early mornings and the long drives and the work, always the work, which was not glamorous and had never been glamorous and which was, despite that, the most fundamentally satisfying thing he had ever done. He thought sometimes about what Dorothea had meant by support. The way she'd said it, weighted with the implication that the absence of a partner was an incompleteness, a structural flaw, a reason to doubt. He'd had support. He'd had it in the form of a woman who had died too young, and a neighbor who smelled like lavender and made ginger cookies, and a lawyer who told him the truth, and an operations manager who expressed approval by ignoring you and going back to work, and a daughter who looked up from her homework on the evening of the biggest dinner of his life and said, "Without fanfare, you look nice, Dad." It wasn't the kind of support that showed up at a table in the Pearson Grand. It didn't photograph well. It didn't impress people who measured things by what was visible. But it had gotten him here. 7 years and 67 employees in a growing company, and a partnership that fit and a card on the fridge. It had gotten him exactly here. And on most mornings when he dropped Zoe at school and watched her walk through the doors with her backpack bouncing and her shoelaces tied unevenly the way they always were no matter how many times he showed her, and drove out to the facility and drank his coffee and started the day. On most mornings, here was enough.